Good evening, good evening, good evening. How are we doing? If you had watched my last video, you'll remember that I had promised you to do a presentation for you regarding Long Island and the history behind Long Island. The, the fact is, I cannot venture to think that somebody's going to be moving someplace and not having an idea of the history behind that place. So therefore, I'm going to take probably 10 or 15 minutes of your time. So grab a cup of coffee, sit down, relax, and follow with me. So if you want to move to Long Island, do you have any notion regarding its history? To start with, we all know the first inhabitant of this area were the Native American. They were known as the Lenape, or sometimes you will have heard them called Delaware. Mostly they live in the western part of what is now known as Long Island. Then the Dutch and English came over in the 17th century or so, and especially famous name that we have to remember at that time was William Alexander, who had bought most of the island. Subsequently, the English decided to turn over the island to the Dutch, and that will take you to about 1673. By 1683, Long Island was known, or shall I say, had 3 of the 12 counties of New York, mainly Kings County, which we know now as Brooklyn, Queens County, and Queens County also had Queens and what is now known as Nassau County, and I'm going to come to that to elucidate that a bit more, and of course Suffolk County. By the 19th century, Long Island was still a rural and agricultural area. There's a lot of herds and so on and so forth. And a few people were moving back and forth around that time, but there was not much going on. Then came the Long Island Railroad. And the Long Island Railroad opened up about 50 stations. And what we will see is that right around the places where those stations were, that's when you have the outgrowth of, different people. And that's where the suburbanizations started taking place. From the let's say for about 1830 to about 1930, the population in Long Island was doubling at every 20 years. And a lot of incorporated cities were being formed, mostly Brooklyn, Long Island City in Queens. By the late 19th century, Long Island became what we will call a summer refuge for people who were working in the city. Okay? And especially on the northern part of Long Island, especially northern part of what we know now as Nassau County, you will see people like J.P. Morgan, the Roosevelt family, especially Robert Roosevelt, and his famous nephew, which most of you will know as Theodore Roosevelt, who became President of the United States, and Roosevelt's son, Quentin, had the Roosevelt Field, right? The mall that I spoke about in another video. The Roosevelt Field was named after him, right? That was Quentin Roosevelt. It's always nice to know this little bit. furthermore, on the northern part of the island, you get what we will call the Gold Coast Mansion on the North Shore, and that's where you'll find the like of Vanderbilt family, John Paul Getty, Charles Pratt, all right? And those were what we will call, the rich and famous, all right? But all along, the movement and the connection between the county and the city was done by boat, right? Until 1883, when the Brooklyn Bridge was built. All right, 1883. At that time also, we know the city as the city of Greater New York, where the city itself, the Kings County and Queens County became one. And by 1899, 1 year later, what we now know as Nassau County, right, which was, remember, at the beginning I mentioned Queens County was Queens and Nassau County. But when that arrangement was made for Queens to become part of the greatest city of New York, that portion became now known as Nassau County. So I need to emphasize that soon after the Brooklyn Bridge was built in 1883, and I'm pretty sure some of you taking notes, by 1903, we now had 7 bridges between 1903 and 1961, namely Williamsburg Bridge in 1903, Queensboro Bridge, 1909, together with Manhattan Bridge, because both were built the same year. In 1916, we had the Hellgate Bridge that takes you from Astoria to the Bronx. In 1936, Triborough Bridge. 1939, Whinstone Bridge. 1961, Truck's Neck Bridge. And the reason I'm mentioning all these is because you have to understand the connotation. And now you have more movement between the city and what we now call the suburb. And then the wave of immigration continued, and now we get in the island the Irish American, the Italian American, the Jewish American, right, that came over. And the first folks who came by, their children and grandchildren now started moving further east, more toward Suffolk County. And that time, since we had such a rush of individuals there, of course we needed means of transportation. And Robert Moses came by and started with the parks, for parks and recreation, and namely the most famous park that was built at that time was the Long Island State Park, where Jones Beach, and started that revolution with Jones Beach and other beaches. And at that point in time, okay, the Southern State Parkway started functioning, then the Northern State Parkway, and last but not least, the Long Island Expressway, also known as I-95. Okay? Now, soon after the war, okay, now you had the GI coming back from the war. Population had increased again, and there's an architect called Levitt started building those Levitt houses, and the first town that was practically built at that time was Levittown, which is started on the Wanta Parkway on the east and the Southern State Parkway on the south. And there were what we will have called a copycat, if we can use that word, that quote unquote they were calling the suburban sprawl, because then in Suffolk County we started seeing the same thing around G Park, right, and Comac, right, east of Levittown. And of course, a lot of things have happened to this island, and we all know, just to mention a few, about 9/11, where so many of the firefighters and other workers have perished. We remember the market crash of 2008, where the sale of homes went from an average of $502,000 to as low as $410,000, 18% drop. And then in 2012, what did we get? Hurricane Sandy came. So the island has taken its toll of different things and so on. But suffice it to say that we couldn't talk about the island and not mention some positives. I couldn't talk about the island and not mention the history of aviation in Nassau County, namely Roosevelt Field, where Charles Lindbergh took off and won that Ortig Prize in 1927 with his round trip from New York to Paris and back. All right. Subsequently, in 1951, the Roosevelt Field itself was dismantled, and we now have, as I said, the shopping mall, Hofstra University, and a few other commercial things. We can't forget the Republic Aviation in Farmingdale, which is right down where Route 110, which is right at the demarcation between Nassau and Suffolk County. And you have to know that the P-47 fighter jets were built at the Republic Airport and school in Farmingdale. And of course, the Grumman Company was right there in Bethpage, where the F-14. And the Grumman also had the Apollo lunar module built there. So Nassau County has a very rich history. And to shift just a little bit for the next couple of minutes, what most folks don't realize is when you're talking about Nassau and Suffolk County, these counties are divided into cities, towns, and what we call hamlets. A lot of folks don't even know the distinction. For example, in Nassau County, we have Glen Cove is its own city. Long Beach is its own city. Then we have three main towns: Hempstead, North Hempstead, and Oyster Bay. Hempstead has about 22 villages and 35 hamlets. And just to name a few, Garden City, Hempstead are two of the villages in the town of Hempstead. North Hempstead has 32 villages and 16 hamlets. To name a few, Great Neck, Worsley, and Westbury are three of the villages in North Hempstead. And Manhasset, Port Washington, two of the hamlets in North Hempstead. Oyster Bay has 18 villages, 18 hamlets. Brookville, Farmingdale, Seacliff are three examples of villages in Oyster Bay, and Syosset, Woodbury, and Plainview are three examples of hamlets in Oyster Bay. Suffolk County, no cities per se, but Suffolk County has 9 towns. The town of Babylon, town of Huntington, Smithtown, Brookhaven, Southampton, Riverhead, Easthampton, Shelter Island, and Islip. And to give you just a little smear of the town of Babylon, has 3 villages and 12 hamlets. Among the villages, Amityville, Babylon, Lindenhurst. Hamlet, Deer Park, North Babylon, and Wyandotte. The town of Huntington, 4 villages and 15 hamlets. Huntington Bay and Northport are 2 examples of the villages in Huntington. Dix Hills, Melville, Greenlawn are 3 examples, the hamlet in Huntington. Since I promised approximately 15 minutes, I'm going to stop there, and I'm hoping that if you had not subscribed here, to please subscribe so that you can get my next video, which will go into some details about some of the towns and the hamlet in Nassau and Suffolk County. Until then, have a good night.